Hi everyone, my name's Maureen O'Brien. I'm the Research Literacy Coordinator here at Western Sydney Library. And we have with us today Damian Almeida, who is from Gale Cengage. And Damian is one of the trainees there with Gale, and he'll be presenting today. Over to you, Damian, and thank you for coming to present to us.
Thank you, Maureen, and good morning and welcome everyone. Today's session is actually one of I say it a lot, it's one of my favorite archives, but it truly is. It's such an impressive archive, the amount of content that we've got within women's studies. Now, just to give you context, at Western Sydney, you've got 4 parts to this archive, so there are 4 individual archives. Each is quite impressive in its own right. But what I'll try to do today is give you an overview for each of these archives, highlight some of the significant collections that are within these archives, and hopefully get you started on exploring through some of this as we go through. So we'll get started. There's no agenda because I'll skip one slide out of the 200 odd plus slides. I'm just joking. Out of the few slides that I have over here. But what's really interesting about when you study women's studies specifically is that much of history is very one-sided, and it's always from the male's perspective in terms of capturing, women's achievements, or for lack of a better way to explain this, also much of the accomplishments of iconic women have been stolen by men, and the women have done the research, they've done the work, but it's always been a man who's taken credit for that, which is sadly a part of history as we know it. But what this archive aims to achieve is to provide an opportunity to witness the female perspective, and it's a really essential source for researchers that are studying women's history, gender studies, social history. This particular image that I have on screen over here is an oral narration by an iconic woman called Sojourn Truth. Now, if you've not heard about her, please do go and read a little bit about her. She produced this oral narration called Ain't I a Woman in her native Pennsylvanian Dutch. It was an oral recitation that was given multiple times at different, meetings and gatherings, but it was never really put to paper till many, many years later. But I'll talk a little bit more about this individual as we come to Women's Studies Part 3. This archive itself is an award-winning archive. This is from one of the latest awards that they've won, the 2023 Platinum Awards, and I think there may have been some in between in 24. I haven't really had a look through it, but it's been winning a fair few awards for its content and the insights that it provides. So to give you context about what you have access to, there are 4 parts to this particular archive. Part 1 is Issues and Identities, that essentially captures the foundation of women's movements, their struggles, their foray into the political circles in about the 19th and 20th century. Part 2 of this particular archive is Voice and Vision, which again is looking at the individuals themselves, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail. Part 3 is looking at some rare titles from the American Antiquarian Society. These are titles that have been written and produced by women, and they've been curated by the American Antiquarian Society. Now, what's really exciting about this is also having access to literature that was produced by women. Now, if you know your history, a lot of the literature that was produced in the 19th and early 20th century, women weren't necessarily given the opportunity to publish under their names. So a lot of this publication would be under pseudonyms. And we've now come to learn who these individuals are behind the pseudonyms as well, which is quite exciting. And of course, the last part of this archive is Female Forerunners, and this is the archive that has a wealth of Australian and New Zealand content in there. But I'll break it down and I'll talk about each of these archives and I'll give you some overviews about them. Let's go to the first one. So we're looking at Issues and Identities. So a little bit about this particular archive with Issues and Identities. There we go, too many animations today. Here we go. So it looks at grassroots feminism in America in the 20th century. It looks at things like the birth control movement. The Malthusian Society is one of many. It looks at documents from the 50s, 60s, and 70s when women were fighting for equality in the different, workforces and things like that. It explores women's health, the issues with mental health. It explores things like, birth control, sex and sexuality of women as well. So one of the other things it also does is it shows how women working in communities in all corners of the world changed lives and cultural perspectives. It brings together some of the most important political, professional, and popular periodicals that were written by and for women across Europe. And there's a bit of Australian content in here if you dive in a little bit deeper as well. It looks at these key issues as well, like sex discrimination, divorce. These were topics that were never really talked about or addressed in the early part of the 20th century or late 19th century, so to speak. It also looks at things like radical feminists as well. Now, a little bit about this collection. Overall, it's about 1.1 million pages. Most of it is in English, but there's bits in other languages as well, like French, German, Spanish as well. Essentially, we're looking at periodicals, organizational records, correspondences, there's personal papers, there's lots of ephemera in here as well, which is quite exciting. Now, all of that 1.1 million pages comes from multiple different source libraries, as you can see over here. There's 10 different source libraries that lend their content into this particular part of the archive. So what we're looking at over here is just part one at this point in time. So about each of these collections, let's go through and explore what they actually cover. So looking at these collections, you can see over here, all of them look at these key topics, things like, domestic culture. It looks at women being ordained into the church, women's expression of sexuality and gender, women's education, women's movements, women in law, women in health, women and having control over their bodies. And women's roles interacting within societies as well. So let's break down each of these collections and look at how they've been grouped together. They've been grouped in these four key areas: social change, activism, political issues or law, and of course, women's role interacting with society. So under social change, the first collection is the Malthusian collection. Essentially, this is a publication, a monthly publication from about 1879. And the articles essentially focus on things like poverty, overpopulation. It looks at race. It looks at birth control. And the publication offered detailed minutes of the league's meetings as well. And it looks at doctors. It looks at policymakers where family planning discussions were held. And it's very serious in its tone. The next one we have is Planned Parenthood Federation of American Records. Essentially what we can find here are minutes of the meeting, articles, speeches, and things of the that the Planned Parenthood and their forerunners are organized as well. It looks at the Birth Control Clinic Research Bureau as well. So really interesting, the history of birth control. It looks at planning and policy and things like that. Moving into activism and grassroots movements, we have the grassroots feminist organizations, which is essentially a collection of files from feminist organizations and women's centers in Boston and San Francisco, both which were hubs of the second wave feminist movement, early feminist movement, let's call it. And it predominantly consists of documents from the Women's Educational Center, or the Women's School, the Abortion Action Coalition, and the Boston chapter of Women Against Violence Against Violence Against Women. So lots of great topics are addressed over there. The second of those, which is part two, is again looking at the founding documents. It's looking at daily administration of this particular league. And it's a really extensive collection of the organization and how they supported women from different countries, cultures, races, religions, and different life circumstances as well. Women's Lives in American Women's Missionaries is a collection that covers the lives and activity of important women in the 19th and 20th century. It looks at, these missionaries who've traveled the globe between around 1840 to 1890. Actually more 1980, sorry, more than like close to over little over 100 years as well. It also has some great records of American pioneer women and their migration over the Oregon Trail and their lives in the Pacific Northwest as well. So essentially, we're looking at missionary records, things like letters, manuscripts that were all written by these missionaries and and about their travels. History, again, is comprises of full-text journals, newspapers, newsletters, and the evolution of the women's rights movements in United States and abroad between 1956 to 1974. And among the longest-running periodicals in this collection is The Ladder. It's a journal of the Daughters of Philetus, the first organization in the United States that was specifically dedicated to lesbian civil and political rights. It's an iconic publication. Women's Health and Mental Health, it looks at, consists of pamphlets, speeches, newsletters, reports, memorandums, conference reports, and it looks at things like, sterilization and parenthood, sex education. It looks at psychology, and it's the largest focus of women's health and mental health collection that relates to abortion and birth control as well. So again, some great topics for your research options. And then, of course, we've got Women and the Law, looking at this particular organization, women's liberation movements and things like that. In grassroots movements, again, this particular collection looks at the methods the Women's International League of Peace used for decades to lobby governments. It looks at demonstrations that they conducted. It looks at campaigns. It looks at speeches and some of these grassroots documentation that they were part of in disarmament, for civil rights movements, conscientious objectors to war, and of course women's rights. The collection records of the Women's Peace Party over here, Samak. This collection is between 1914 to 1920, half of which consists of primarily correspondence documents, their administrative documents of this particular organization from both their national offices as well as some of their state branches as well. It includes things like board meetings, minutes, speeches, membership lists, resolutions. It looks at financial information. So if you're doing any research on these groups, this is some great information in here. This particular collection, the records of the Women's Peace Union, primarily consist of correspondence files, but it also includes the history of the Women's Peace Union, their minutes of the meeting, their press releases, the literature, the speeches that they gave. This collection will interest those researching pacifist movements in the United States in the early 20th century, which was quite popular at that point in time. And of course, there's these three other collections in here as well that are related back to the political, law, and labor issues as well. So lots and lots of great collections in this particular archive. Through the European women's periodicals, this material goes as far back as 1830, but most of these documents are towards the late 1800s, so 1880 to about 1940. And it looks at content from across, France, Germany, Austria, Belgium. It looks at Dutch, Indonesia, the Netherlands, lots of great countries that are included over here. And again, it looks at women's role in interacting with society. So if I were to summarize all of those collections, and this is just a quick sort of a table, so to speak, that if you're looking for content that relates back to the political, law, labor, those 4 collections over there will actually give you as much information. I think this is probably the most crucial slide to show you what these collections essentially address in this particular part of the archive. All right, we'll skip through this in the interest of time, but we'll look at there's some fantastic content examples over here as well. You can see over here interesting research areas about women and their role in society during and after the war. Much of their contributions during the Great War or the Second War were often sort of overlooked, so to speak, which was sadly very bad. But you can see over here, it also looks at women's involvement in active war services as well as Air Force service pilots. There's a lot of great options over here. Women were very instrumental in being the cog and the most important part of the machinery that generated information during the war. A lot of them worked as secretaries, as, data analysts, as we call them now, and churning out the information that the Allied forces were producing during the war. So their role was quite significant, but often overlooked as well. Also during the civil rights movement, you can see over here, women worked towards pushing not just for the civil rights, but also equality for women as well, not just the civil rights. They were also trying to get their voices heard as well. And they were pioneers. There were some iconic pioneers that I've tried to capture over here, like Betty Friedan. There's the other one I can see is Eleanor Roosevelt, and Gloria Steinman, all in iconic women who have, in some shape or form, have championed the cause of women's rights and have sort of shattered the glass ceiling, so to speak. All right, let's move into part two, which is voice and vision. So in Voice and Vision, what's a little bit about this particular archive? It's around 800,000 pages. This individual over here, Mary Guantrop, was actually an English suffragette. She was a socialist, a trade unionist, and she was an editor. And she was actually referred to as the Mary Militant Saint. And from this photo, you wouldn't really tell that. But, don't let a picture fool you. I mean, she was quite a firebrand for championing women's rights. And essentially what we're looking at over here are manuscript documents, periodicals, and some printed books. Lots of great source libraries, again, in this particular archive. This one has a strong focus on periodicals that were often ignored by some of our competitors due to the expense in scanning, in digitizing this content. It looks at women's activism beyond the traditional focus of suffrage and sexual discrimination, and some great collections in here. So the collections in this archive come from the American Antiquarian Society, the British Library, the Swarthmore College of Peace Collection, the Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives, the National Archives in the United Kingdom, and the University of California. Coverage for the women's political activism such as suffrage, birth control, pacifism, civil rights, social movements, etc. have all been addressed over here in this particular archive. Lots of monographs as well from the American Antiquarian Society. And again, these are separate from the ones that we'll find in part 3 of the Women's Studies Archive, which are printed collections from the American Antiquarian Society. But this particular collection is quite an eclectic mix of topics that looks at these books that we see here. It looks at things like, alcohol and temperance movements, which was sort of, if you go all the way back and start reading about the temperance movement, which was the precursor to a lot of different movements that have since spun out of that particular original movement. It looks at the abolition of slavery. It looks at divorce. It looks at female crime. It looks at health and hygiene. It looks at sexual discrimination. It looks at women in publishing. It looks at women's legal statuses, women's suffrage and rights. It also looks at Indian women, but when I say Indian women, I'm talking about Native American women. But back then, historically, they were referred to as Indian women. But it's not Indian women from India, so to speak. In terms of women's periodicals, they cover every aspect of the surge of the emancipation activities between the passing of the Married Women's Property Act in 1870, which was sort of the giving women universals all the way up to sort of giving women universal suffrage rights in 1928. I could be mistaken there. But it also looks at anarchism, it looks at pacifism, it looks at reproductive rights and abolition as well. So lots of great, fantastic content within these periodical collections over here. Women's Printing in Society, some beautiful publications in here as well. And these are, like I said earlier at the very start, during this time period, late 1800s, early 1900s, women were not given the same or equal opportunities to publish under their own names. So therefore, you would find a lot of the publications under pseudonyms, and we'll find a great deal of these publications in part 3 of the Women's Studies Archive. Then looking at some of these individual collections, Anne Garland Spencer Papers is essentially a collection of correspondence and writings by Spencer, as well as biographical and family material. She was a huge pacifist and a founding member of the Women's Peace Party in 1950. So we can see there's lots of parallels between this particular collection and how it sort of really links up with part 1, where we're seeing those pacifist organizations. And of course, some of these women are talked about in part 1 of the archive as well. So they really sort of work well with each other. And it's fantastic that you have all 4 parts to this archive. Hannah Johnson Bailey was an active participant in the suffrage movement, but she was also interested in the influence of militarism of children. During the early part of the late 1800s, children were being conscribed into the army as early as 16. And her focus was that children should be children, which is, I completely agree with that, for as long as they can be children. And she was also interested in the reform on women's prisons, the abolition of capital punishment, and wanted to promote more women to do missionary work. So this particular collection over here looks at personal papers, correspondences, diaries, journals. There's some great unpublished articles, biographical information as well available, not just of Hannah Johnson Bailey, but a few other individuals are included in here as well. Linda G. Wentworth Papers. Wentworth believed that socialism and pacifism were synonymous and urged women to play a really important role in promoting peace by seeking election to public offices and becoming leaders in the peace movement. Her view was that, women can do a much better job than men have, who just want to sort of, start wars and live in those early days of, fighting and glory days. But it was a really interesting collection to go through. Wentworth was at the advisory committee of the Women's Peace Society. She was a member of the International League for Peace and Freedom, and quite a few other organizations as well, including the Boston League of Women's Voters as well. Edwin Doak Mead and Lucia Ames Mead Papers, and I notice how I just put her husband on the little corner of the page. Didn't want to give him too much real estate. But Edwin Doak and Lucia Mead were both leading pacifists and social reformers in the United States and the international peace movement. Their work directed the World Peace Foundation. They participated in many international peace congresses, as well as being the American delegate to the International Peace Bureau. Lucia was a leading member of many feminist and pacifist organizations, including the Women's Peace Party and many U.S. feminist associations. They're very vocal about their views on pacifism. Hannah Cloutier Hull Papers, a large part of this material focuses on Hannah's work within the peace movement and these organizations. Her interest in women's rights is represented by items on women's suffrage. So what we can find over here are correspondence documents. We can find lots of ephemera from movements that they were trying to start in China and India as well. Plus it also looks at other individuals as well, other women who were instrumental in these organizations that are captured over here by Hannah. Papers of Mary E. Gontrop. Now, Mary initially became involved in socialist and labor politics while working as an organizer for the Women's Social and Political Union in the early 1900s. Alongside her, I would like to say, friend Dora, she started a new radical feminist journal, The Free Woman, in 1911. I think this could be it. I'm not too sure if the image that I've put in here. But she sailed across to the United States in about early 1900s and started to support the struggle for women's suffrage in America. And she joined the Women's Suffrage Party. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was comes from a family of reformers and activists. She spoke at many organized workers. She led many immigrant worker strikes. She wrote pamphlets, articles, books with the aim of convincing the public that private ownership and the profit system was inhumane. She was an excellent orator, and she left a permanent record of her protest and campaigns through her writings, which we'll actually find in this particular collection over here. We can find biographical information. There's autobiographical notes, telegrams, there's speeches, poems, diaries, and her itineraries from moving between these various protests and orally speaking at these protests, so to speak. But she was a significant figure in the feminist movement, to say, nonetheless. These are records created or inherited by the Women's National Commission. Over here, essentially, these are documents that the commission collected: constitutional papers, administrative papers, meeting agendas, and things like that. Records of the Equal Opportunities Commission. Again, we're looking at some minutes of the meeting papers, surviving papers of other committees, major case papers, and all of this is between 1960s to about 2000. Oh, yeah, 2007. Sorry, should have read that. The next one is Commission Femenil Mexicana National Archives. It's essentially looking at administrative and event files from this particular organization over here. This particular organization also promoted programs that provided solutions for women and their families, specifically Mexican women. It also was quite involved in the Chicano movement as well. Women whose involvement is often obscured. I think there's another part 4 of this archive series talks a little bit more about a significant figure in the Chicano movement. We'll come to that in a few minutes. The National Network of Hispanic Women's Archives is a primary source that documents Hispanic women and how they've been confined to unpublished dissertations and government documentations. So it's a really exciting collection as well, looking at minority women and minority organizations or individuals from minority background. Alicia Escalante Papers, again, it's addressed over here as well, is a Chicano activist championing the welfare of her community. So again, correspondence, speeches, articles. So this particular archive over here, as you can see, there's a lot of organizational documentation, speeches, private papers, which if you have researchers that are interested in researching women's organizations, their structure, the individuals involved in these organizations, part 2 of Women's Studies is the go-to. Some quick content examples over here. You can see it's an excellent resource for studying women's suffrage movements. Lots of great, just doing a keyword search on women's studies. There's lots of content coming out from Australia as well. And the trick with searching for content from Australia is doing keyword searches, or like we saw on Tuesday's presentation. It could have been Monday. I'm not too sure when we did the last one. Is using topic finder and term frequency tools that exist across all Gale databases. Those tools will draw out the information that is, has content that relates back to Australia and New Zealand or any other country that's close to our particular countries. So again, the content itself has not been tagged Australian content. You'll have to do keyword searches, a combination of multiple keyword searches. What I like about this particular archive, I'm a massive, at least I used to be a massive comic book collector before it, became mainstream. But sadly, marriage fixed that issue. So I can't spend any more money on comics these days. But I love the fact that we've got these dime novels over here on this particular archive, which is actually really. I'm being a visual person. I love the drawing. I love storytelling through imagery. Different people learn differently. I'm one of those people who loves a little bit of imagery to go along with the text that I'm reading. You can also explore topics of women's activism over here. You can see some great examples over here from different organizations that talk about activism. Well, there's a wealth of Australian content available again over here. More than 3,000 articles covering that contain the term Australia, and more than 2,000 terms that contain the term New Zealand over here as well. The one on the right, that's Victory in New Zealand. I'm talking about when New Zealand becoming one of the first countries to give women the right to vote. And such an important document that I think, it should be showcased more often. All right, coming into part 3 of this particular archive is looking at rare titles from the American Antiquarian Society. So these books or monographs over here have been curated by the American Antiquarian Society. So whilst many of these authors may be recognized by their names, a vast majority of these authors and their works is being digitized for the very first time over here. And the objective for this particular archive in the series is to provide researchers with a canon of American women's literature because nothing previously existed in this space over here. So again, it's curated by the American Antiquarian Society and it's got fiction genres as well as non-fiction. And there are content that has been authored or edited by women or written by women. It's a little over 1 million pages over here, or 5,700 monographs between 1820 to 1922, and it was released back in 2021, as you can see over here. So the coverage itself covers some really great topical areas: children's literature, fashion and society. It has things on etiquette as well. It has diaries. It has political ephemera, personal papers, recipe books. So if you love cooking at home, there's some really great recipes that you may wish to try over here. You wouldn't find a chicken parma or things like that over here. These are much more complex recipes. But why is this collection so important? Because a canon of American women's writing never did exist. And women's narratives from history are incredibly underrepresented in higher education syllabi. And it's really exciting for digital humanities to have access to writings by women, to be able to text and data mine. And you can see over here, what I've tried to do over here is break down some of the authors that are mentioned in this particular archive, break that down by their ethnicity, where I could tell, they're either, African American women, they're indigenous women, or they're Latina women over here as well. But again, a lot of these, there's also content over here written under pseudonyms as well. It's rare and unique content, and what we've done is we've done this dedupe just to make sure that this content, it does not overlap with the content that's available in American fiction, which is one of our other archives. So you can see over here between Google Books, the Haiti, oops, sorry, I went too quickly. I'll go back a slide. Between these 4 areas over here, there's very, very minimal content. A vast majority of the content in this archive has been digitized for the very first time and will not appear on any of these open source areas over here. Now, this is just a quick table that I put together. I know it's a little bit hard to read in blue, but what I've tried to do over here is break down the ethnicity of the author, the author's name, their title, the date of publication, and what notes we have. And I can share this in an Excel sheet. And what I'll try to do is put this information into an Excel sheet, and I'll share this with you as well after today's session. So just a quick highlight of some of that content over there. Looking at some examples over here, there's some really rare titles. your academics and students have access to over here. The beautiful titles. If you'd love old books, I must say, quite recently I had the opportunity to visit the Museum of the Bible in where was it, in Washington, which was actually during the week of the elections, where he who shall not be named may or may not have won it. But whilst I was there, I really fangirled out on the those old Bibles, and some of these Bibles go back 1,000 years. And I will say this: looking at a book, sorry, Siri, not you. Looking at, sorry, that was Siri trying to get into the conversation. Looking at these old books, the handwriting, the drawing was just absolutely spectacular. And to see an old book, physically, and then when you look at something on the digital equivalent of it, you sometimes take it for granted. But I just wanted to, emphasize how amazing old books are, the amount of work that they went through in putting some of this content together. Here's one from Harriet Maxwell Converse, who sort of entered public life after her second marriage, and she and her husband traveled quite extensively through the 1800s, and where she met, a member of the Seneca, who was an Aboriginal person. When I say Aboriginal, again, Native American Aboriginal person, uh, uh, who was an engineer with General Ulysses Grant during the American Civil War. Uh, and she writes about her experiences over here, which is a really interesting read. Maria Ruz de Burton was one of the first female Mexican authors to write in English, and in her career she published two books. Who would have thought it, in 1872, The Squatter and the Dawn, and again, both are available over here as well. You can read through this as well. And Maria's work over here is considered a precursor to Chicano literature, giving highlighting this particular community, talking about giving full rights, citizenship rights to these particular individuals of this particular community. Lots of great options over here to read. You can see over here it talks a little bit about an individual over here, and the color of their skin. And again, while reading literature from this time period, it's quite evident that we'll find content that's often quite distressing. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is a selection of poetries that depict the life of an African American woman's experience. You can see over here this particular one, The Slave's Mother, or it talks about the colored people in America. So it's from the point of view of an African American woman and her experiences as what it is to be a woman of color living in America. Sojourn Truth, this was the woman that was on the front cover of my presentation. She was an American abolitionist and a women's rights activist. She was born into slavery, but she escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in about early 1800s, 1820s or so. And after going to court to recover her son in 1828, she became one of the first black women to win a case against a white man, which was quite significant in that time period. Her speech was delivered in 1851, which was Ain't I a Woman? And it became widely popular during that time period. In 2014, Sojourn Truth was included in Smithsonian Magazine's list of 100 most significant women of all time. We just so happen to have the Smithsonian Magazine as well, if you want to look that up. I'm not sure if you do, though, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah, there's also a statue of her on Capitol Building. Also, although whilst I was there in the US, I couldn't really see it because everything was barricaded because someone decided to, storm a Capitol the last time round. Didn't get to see it. All right, so getting into part 4 of the archive, Female Forerunners Worldwide. Just a little bit about this archive. This is the archive that has the most Australian and New Zealand content in it. So the 4th archive is one of the more interesting collections over here. One of the interesting collections over here is Carolina Jones, who was one of the founding members of one of the first African American women to start an advertising agency, and she became so popular she actually worked with KFC and came up with their iconic slogan, "We do chicken right." Who can complain with that? I mean, everyone loves chicken, well, except the vegans. But then, I mean, thank you, Carolina, for that iconic quote. But there's some really great topics that this particular archive covers. It looks at the abolition of slavery. It looks at advertising and women getting into the advertising space. It looks at birth control, healthcare, medicine, nursing, religion. There's a wealth of nursing journals that are included over here. Now, as my name may suggest, Damien, there's also a wealth of supernatural collections available over here as well, which is quite exciting. All right, there's about 600,000 pages over here. You can see some of the disciplines that it supports over here. Themes like healthcare, education are very popular themes. There's also content coming in from the Royal College of Nursing and a wealth of content from Australia as well. All right, the source institutions over here, as you can see, the Amistad Research Centre, Library Congress, London Metropolitan Archives, Royal College of Nursing, Smithsonian Institute, the State Library of New South Wales. Now, the one of the things over here from the State Library of New South Wales is the Australian and New Zealand women's organizations as well, which looks at the National Young Women's Christian Association of Australia, the Council of Jewish Women of New South Wales, the Royal New Zealand Society of Healthcare and Women and Children, and of course, how can I forget the hidden treasures of the Mitchell Library periodicals as well. So we'll come into that in a little bit more. So in terms of the collections over here, you can see there's 21 collections from 10 different source libraries. There's some really great collections in here as well. Sorry, I skipped through that very quickly. Go back a step. So you can see over here, there's the Royal College of Nursing, the historical nursing journals. Plus, we've also got content coming in from the State Library of New South Wales as well. My favorite is the Senate House Library. These four collections over here talk a lot about spiritualism, demonic possession, seances and things like that. So if you've got nothing to read with your glass of wine over the weekend, if you're not into cricket, which is going to start at 1:30 today, this is a great collection for you to explore because it's really exciting. And also I will say that this particular part of the archive or Women's Studies archive, there's a lot of handwritten content that exists in this archive. And what we've done at Gale is we've introduced handwritten technology. So any document that's handwritten, we've got OCR available for that. So if you're unable to read cursive, fear not, it's available as plain text. You can read the plain text on the side. But there's again, the Smithsonian Institution is the one where you can find the Carolyn Jones collection. The State Library of New South Wales, we've got two collections from them, the Hidden Treasures of the Mitchell Library periodicals and Australia New Zealand women's organizations. The National Archives, the HM, which is Her Majesty Prisons Holloway Records as well, is actually a really exciting one to read through as well. It covers some iconic women who were instrumental in the suffragette movement. So I'll try to quickly cover that off. So the first one is the papers of Mary McLeod Bethune, who was, an a woman of African American ancestry. She was the 15th of 17 children. I mean, it's a little bit over an entire football field. Imagine family gatherings. They've got one team, which is exciting. And this is, I laugh at this because I come from super big families myself, so I can completely understand having a complete team. But her story is really iconic. She rose from poverty to become one of the nation's most distinguished African-American leaders and most prominent black woman of her time. The character of this remarkable woman is best reflected in her last words in her will and testament, where she says, "I leave you love, I leave you hope, I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. I leave you a thirst for education. I leave you with respect and for the use of power. I leave you faith. I leave you racial dignity. I leave you the desire to live harmoniously with your fellow man. I leave you a responsibility to our young people." I mean, if it just says it all in her last will and testament, uh, which is it just says so much about the individual herself. Anyway, let's keep moving on. The Papers of Freddie Washington was an actress, a dancer, a singer. She was a casting consultant. And the collections over here essentially look at, correspondence materials, their photographs, their scripts, programs, there's scrapbooks, and she was an equal rights activist as well for women to have equal opportunity within the arts world. Women's Joint Congressional Community is a coalition of existing women's rights organizations. Again, we're looking at minutes, correspondence, information, and what it essentially addresses is things like civil rights, social security, anti-lynching, school lunch programs, and things like that. Papers of Louis Chandler Moulton includes the correspondence of her correspondence with the English poet Westland Marston and his son Peter Burke Marston. Louis Chandler was an American poet herself, a storyteller and a critic. So a lot of the content that we have here consists of letters and her correspondence, her book of travels, and things like that. Then we have content from Her Majesty's Prison in Holloway. Essentially, we're looking at, several well-known suffragettes that were housed at Her Majesty's Prison. There are two collections over here. This is one. There's another one that'll come up in a moment. It also included, iconic women like the Pankhurst sisters, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, who were housed at Her Majesty's Prison. It also looks at murderers like Edith Thompson, Amelia Sachs, and things like that as well. And it includes photographs as well, which is quite exciting. So there's about 24 collections over here as well within this particular collection. So I'll call them sub-collections if you'd mind. Then we get to the historic nursing journals. Now, within these nursing journals over here, which is not from, this is from the Royal College of Nursing, but there's a wealth of Australian content that you'll find over here. The Australian Bush Nursing Journal and the Australian Nurses Journal can be found within this particular collection over here. It's some of the earliest publications from the 20th century that look at things like gender, class, ethnicity, colonialism, and nursing itself. So some iconic, all of this digitized for the very first time that you can see over here. Really interesting content. And there you can see there's these two Australian publications that feature in this particular part of the archive. All right, coming up to the end, the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses records, again, newsletters, press releases, pamphlets from this particular association. Then we have the Katz Prince collection. This is also another iconic woman. Lucy Carey Prince was a pioneer. Sadly died at the age of 91, but she has a really iconic backstory, which I'm not going to go into because it's one of the things where I can spend a really long time talking about some of these really inspirational women. But she wrote a very famous poem called Bar Fights. Oh, it could be, I think it was Bar Fights, which was preserved orally for, over 50, 60 years till it was finally put into paper and written down. The Harriet Tubman, now, I mean, if you haven't heard of Harriet Tubman, you should go and if you're a visual person and if you don't have time to read, trust me, do what I do. There's a movie about Harriet Tubman available that you can go and watch. She is one of the most, and I'm not going to say this in a very bad way, but she was one of the most badass women I know. Her life story is so inspirational in what she's done. She's a nurse, a spy, a scout, and she led over 300 slaves to freedom through the Underground Railway. So very inspirational woman. Although you looking at this particular photo, you wouldn't really tell that, but very inspirational, beautiful. This is the content that we have here is some really great content about Harriet Tubman. Gwendolyn Bennett Papers, again, is one of the, remembered as one of the poets of the 1920s, Renaissance in Harlem. She was an artist and a political activist, so we're looking at a collection of her personal papers over here. Eustabe Cosme is, again, a woman of African-Cuban ancestry. She was a poet, an actress, and she was a interpreter of African Antillean verse. It's a kind of a verse that is orally narrated. Ida Holden papers, this is where we get to the good stuff. I was saving this, is looking at spiritualism. It's looking at psychedelic, oh, not psychedelic, psychic research. Psychedelic research is something different. She's also looking at this really interesting thing that I had to go read up about called thought transference. Thought transference was huge in the 15th century. It was the premise that a person sitting here in Melbourne could think something, and someone sitting, let's say, at Western Sydney University, like Maureen, for example, would be receiving my thoughts and acting upon those thoughts, which is complete, poppycock, because it doesn't work that way. I'm sitting over here, my daughter's 2 rooms away. I can't even if I yell out what to do, she's not going to do it. So imagine something like thought transference working. But it was huge in the 15th century. So it's a really interesting thing to read about. All right, we'll skip through. Then we've got the Edinburgh seances, again, looking at, people trying to contact people who've passed on. And it's a huge collection of writings about that, tarot readings and things like that. You can see there's lots of handwritten content over here as well that you can sort of browse through and read through. And then we've got the Carolyn Augusta Foley papers, again, another individual who was huge into contacting spirits from the world beyond. And she got into it after the death of her son during the First World War. So what we're looking at over here are notebooks, diaries, and things like that. Some beautiful handwriting that you can browse through and read through as well. Then we've got diaries about spiritualism as well. And again, lots of handwritten content over here. So lots of great collections over here about spiritualism in the world after. Carolyn Robinson Jones, the one who came up with that iconic slogan about KFC and we do chicken right, started her own advertising agency. And essentially what we're looking at in this collection is her work within the advertising agency. So you can see over here the creative document that was put together about coming up with that slogan, we do chicken right, which I'm kind of feeling kind of hungry right now. Lots of great documents over here about this particular agency. And God, sorry, I'm thinking about chicken. I don't know why. But anyway, I'm going to move on very quickly so I can get to lunch. KFC, here's the document that you can browse through. And then we come to the Australian New Zealand Women's Organization. Again, remember, this is from the State Library of New South Wales. We're looking at some really great publications in here as well, like the National Young Women's Christian Association of Australasia, the Committee for Promoting the Emigration of Females to the Australian Colonies. Fantastic collection of documents over here. And the Hidden Treasures of the Mitchell Library over here. There's 57 periodicals included in here with the Women's Voice, the Australian Women, the Australian Women's Magazine and Domestic Journal as well. Lots of great content over here to browse through. I've got a listing of all of the publications and the date range for these publications as well. We can share this information with you as well. But I will share this after lunch today because, like I said earlier, my mind's on chicken right now. Here's the second of those Her Majesty's Prison Holloway records over here. Again, it contains some really great information, and this works really well with this collection over here, the Suffragettes. It looks at things like arrest records. It looks at calendar of prisoners. It looks at personal statements by these suffragettes who were imprisoned for their beliefs and their protests. This one I found really exciting and I wanted to share with you. This one is from Her Majesty's Prison about Emmeline Pankhurst being sort of let out of the prison due to bad health. And she's been told that she has to come back on the 15th of July, once she gets better. Who would have thought about that? Letting prisoners go out and says, hey, you've got to come back in a few days once you feel better. I will, absolutely. If I ever went to prison and someone let me out, I'd never be coming back. But I'm just saying that, but I'm not going to go to prison. But then again, you can see again this, there's some really great documentation over here about force feeding her, about how she was refusing food and things like that. The last of these collections is from Yale Divinity. It's the strongest collection that looks at missions, missionaries and things like that. So it's a fantastic collection as well if that's something that you're researching. So that quickly wraps up everything. 5 key points about the women's studies that I wanted to mention is that it has a wealth of Australian, New Zealand content. It's not just the UK and US. There's bits of Australian content across each of these 4 parts of the archive. A majority of the New South Wales content of the State Library is brand new scanning. And of course, don't forget to check out the Senate House Library of those, the supernatural collections. So I'm going to skip through. This is just some related archives. We'll skip through this. Now, the rest of the archives, the rest of the slide that I have over here is talking about the learning centers. We looked at that on Monday with the historical newspapers, but we're coming up on the hour. And I'm not saying that I'm hungry, but I know most of you also would be after talking about chicken for so long. So I will leave it at that.
As always, Damien, that was very informative and also very entertaining. Thank you.